summarize the discussion we had this morning on the session on the ways to resumption of tourism. It was an important session because where the tourism is a world, it's sector by the crisis, as you mentioned, Pascal, in your introduction, with minus 70% of tourism. And we had this study by Vincent mentioning that in the beginning, it was expecting only a 20 or 30% down, then it's 58%, and now we are around 70% and even more. With the loss of tourism, it was also demonstrated this morning that there is a major job loss in the world, and it was also said that we will need 5 to 6 years to recover to go back to the 2018 level, which is such a long time. We have a very rich discussion with the roundtable presentation and with the individual presentation. What was quite interesting in my view is that both during the roundtable and during the individual presentation, we had a lot of examples of policies being enforced in most of the PEC economies, which was very interesting. And from this discussion and from the main issue addressed this morning, I will try to derive some conclusion and also some recommendation. There are some good news and there's still some bad news, and I will start with good news and then see what we can do with regard to bad news and how to overcome this bad news. First, start with good news. Some countries, and we heard that this morning, have been very successful in eliminating COVID. You had the example of New Zealand, for instance. We had the example of French Polynesia and from also New Caledonia. Another good news, all economies, all PEC economies and all countries worldwide are willing to reopen as soon as possible to tourism. With regard to reopen tourism, but two good news, air travel recovery. We think that there is a 60% travelers want to travel again, which is quite a good news. We had also good news about the recovery by airport with by 2023 and 2024, major recovery for airport. But within this recovery, there are two different approaches. Speakers this morning and presenters this morning mentioned that we can be very optimistic for the EU, but less optimistic for Asian and Pacific economies and Asian countries. But there's still good news because all airports are going to recover from these pandemics. Another good news, you see that all regions in the world, all economies, all PEC economies, all countries try to facilitate the resumption of tourism, but there are several approaches were pointed out this morning. The EU Green Pass, the UN WTO recommendation, which just passed recently last week. Several speakers this morning talk about digital pass, what digital pass should be, and how this should be implemented. We were talking about travel bubble, green corridor, namely in the Asian economies. We have this very interesting approach by New Zealand about the traffic light approach, and also about the the pro and cons about exclusion and elimination strategy being put forward by the New Zealand government. And as Pascal mentioned, the elimination strategy in New Zealand is quite successful presently. We had already this presentation on IATA airline travel pass, and also what the representative of IATA mentioned. He mentioned that he was not only talking about digital pass, but what I love when he said we are talking about wallet of credentials. I think it's very useful to have this term of wallet of credential to see what can be done worldwide to facilitate and to recover toward more tourism activities. But in front of this quite good news, even if this good news will take some time to be implemented, we have still some bad news. And I think that's what we have to work on. Bad news because some economies, and mainly developing economies, we were told this morning that there was a big difference between developed economies and developing economies in the way they are recovering from COVID-19 pandemics. Some economics rely widely on tourism activities. And for these economies, which are widely relying on tourism, there is a need for them to reopen quickly. If they are not reopening quickly, they could run a risk of going bankrupt. We can see that in some economies, and I've seen that Vincent is all right with me. I've seen that the government in Polynesia mentioned if there is the recovery of tourism in Polynesia government can go bankrupt within the 2 or 3 coming months, at the later by the month of September. We have the same example in Thailand as well. But there is some reluctance, both in these countries, which are badly suffering for this loss of tourist people. There's some reluctance because local people are afraid of a new spread of pandemic if tourism are going back to visit the economies of the countries. It is very effective in Thailand. It is very effective in economies like Korea as well. It was mentioned very effective also in the Pacific Island countries. There is also a fear, not only of local people, as was said this morning, but there is also a fear by local governments. And this fear have to be overcome. Another bad news and something should be done. This, as it was mentioned by Eduardo this morning, and also other speakers mentioned that there is a strong risk of uneven recovery. Uneven recovery for small and medium-sized enterprises, which are being involved in tourism activities. It's the example in the case, for instance, in Thailand, in the case in New Caledonia, in the case, namely, in French Polynesia and in the Pacific Island. There's a risk for women also, which are the first which will go out of work in tourism. And it's not only in developing economies. We have the same in Europe. We have the same in Paris. We are lacking a lot of tourist people at the time being, and women are going out of work for that. And this, as also mentioned by Eduardo, the self-employed people. A fourth risk for bad news is how long this lockdown, multinational or global lockdown will be. It will be 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. We don't know. Everyone wants to reopen, but we have no very precise step to do that. There are no homogeneous steps toward measures to be taken. This morning, we had a lot of steps which are being put forward by local government, by local countries. But for the time being, as is what mentioned by the representative of IATA, there is a lot of confusion for passengers. Some mentioned that the testing regimes are very different from one country for another countries. Some mentioned that vaccines are not available for all what it should be. Some mentioned that vaccine has not been distributed equally. But also on the other side, some mentioned that vaccine is a key, but vaccine is disproportionate, and it was also mentioned that there is a strong vaccine hesitancy in several economies and Pacific economies. So what could be done? There are travel bans, there are border closures, there are quarantine. And it was said that if countries want to put forward quarantine, it's more than 84% of the passenger who would not be willing to travel in case of quarantine is being effective in the countries they want to visit. And also this quarantine, even if it is 1 week, 2 weeks, it's very costly for the passengers. That's about what I would like to say for these good news and bad news. But I would like to complete very quickly with some recommendation from the discussion we had this morning. I think we had 3 types of recommendation being put forward to us and to be discussed within the PEC in the months to come. First, it was said so many times this morning that we really need more coordination between the different government and between the international entities and the government. It was said that there is already a very good point and a very good start toward this coordination, because there was a sharing of information which has been very effective. And the representative for Aéroport de Paris, the representative for IATA, mentioned that this sharing of information is very efficient, up to date. There is also a need for more confidence between the country, more confidence for the vaccine, more confidence for mutual reconnection of the vaccine and mutual reconnection of the green passport, of the EU green pass, of the also what was said, I was just reading, I received a copy of the UNWTO recommendation just during this session. And in this UNWTO recommendation, there is a need to share the information and to mutual recognition of this information. And finally, I think we need a collective approach. This session show and demonstrate that we are the good way to benefit from this collective approach. And this morning we have demonstrated that we are likely to put together so many recommendations and try to figure out these recommendations will be put forward by PEC in a pretty short time. And in conclusion, I think that this session has widely demonstrated that there is a very wide and very large hope for resumption of tourism and for a very soon recommendation. And I think this session and PEC and all the presenters this morning and all the roundtable people this morning demonstrate that PEC and other international grouping are working for. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jean-Luc, for this conclusion, which I think I totally agree with you with the main one of this morning. There remain huge challenges short-term in the recovery and the resumption of global mobility. And none of these challenges can be addressed without more work together, more coordination within tech, globally, within various international organizations. We could translate this sort of well-known mantra now, which addresses the sanitary side, that no one is safe until everybody is safe. I think we could say that no tourist will recover until all tourists will recover. That can be the provisional conclusion of this morning. Thanks for your participation. We will be back together at the same time, 8 p.m., 8 a.m. CET, 2 p.m. Your time in the Pacific tomorrow. And the challenge of tomorrow will be to try and see a bit more forward. Although what we had this morning is that the picture is still extremely blurred. We cannot wait to try and see what shape will be this famous new normal. So rendezvous tomorrow for the second part of our session. And many thanks for the preparations of today, for having, for most of you, remain within your time slot. Great to have fixed a few glitches here and there. Well done, and back with you tomorrow morning. For me, tomorrow afternoon and night for you in the Pacific. Bye, folks.